Tonight, we are traveling into the quiet corners of the human past, places where certainty matters and the evidence grows strangely heavy. Archaeology explains most of our story with patience and care, stone tools shaped slowly, settlements rising a little at a time, traditions leaving clear trails through soil and bone. But a small number of finds resist that calm order, not because they are dramatic, but because they're real, verified, and still unexplained. These objects and places were not pulled from legend or rumor. They were uncovered carefully, studied by professionals, cataloged in museums, and debated in journals. These discoveries do not overthrow science. They slow it down. They introduce hesitation. They create moments where explanations circle, revise, and pause, not from ignorance, but from evidence that refuses to fit cleanly into what we thought we understood. But why do certain archaeological discoveries remain unresolved even after decades of careful study? What does it mean when physically real evidence refuses to align with established timelines and cultural patterns? How can complex technology or monumental construction appear without a clear developmental history? And why do these unanswered cases matter more to science than the ones already explained? Tonight, we'll visit a few of these quiet puzzles. We'll look at what was found, where it was found, and why it still gives researchers sleepless nights. But before we begin, if you enjoy these journeys, gentle, soothing, and quietly filled with wonder, I'd be grateful if you gave this one a like and perhaps tap subscribe. It helps other curious dreamers find their way to this peaceful little corner of the internet. And if you'd be so kind, let me know in the comments, where are you listening from tonight, and what time is it where you are? It's always a joy to see how far across the world this little sleepy corner of science travels. Now take a slow, deep breath, let your shoulders soften, and together let's step quietly into the questions the past has left unanswered. As we move deeper into these quiet corners of the past, the story slows again, not because knowledge disappears, but because its shape changes. In archaeology, not knowing is not an empty space. It is a carefully held pause, a place where evidence has been gathered, examined, weighed, and returned to the table again and again, yet still refuses to settle into a single explanation. There is an important difference between what has not been explored and what remains unsolved. Unexplored places are silent simply because no one has listened yet. Unsolved questions are louder than that. They speak through measurements, dates, materials, and patterns that are already known, already studied, already real. The ground has been disturbed, the objects lifted, the soil layers read like pages, and still the story does not move forward in a straight line. These are not gaps caused by neglect. They are pauses caused by evidence that pulls in more than one direction at once. Uncertainty can exist even when the data is strong. A stone can be dated, a material can be traced, a site can be mapped down to the smallest contour, and yet meaning does not automatically rise from precision. Archaeology does not deal in living systems that can be restarted or adjusted. It listens to what remains after life has passed through and moved on. Every artifact is separated from its original hands by centuries or millennia of erosion, collapse, reuse, and forgetting. Even the clearest data arrives softened by time. Unlike laboratory sciences, archaeology cannot rerun the past. There are no controlled experiments waiting to be repeated. A tool buried in sediment cannot be placed back into its moment and observed again. What happened? Happened once, and only the residue remains. Instead of testing ideas through repetition, archaeology tests them through convergence. Multiple lines of evidence are gathered: material composition, wear patterns, environmental traces, spatial arrangement, radiocarbon dates. When these independent clues point toward the same conclusion, confidence grows. When they do not, restraint becomes necessary. This is why disagreement is not a weakness here, but a discipline. Competing interpretations can coexist for years without one being discarded. Each is held against the evidence, not to defeat the others, but to see which one bends least under scrutiny. Sometimes all of them bend. When that happens, the most responsible answer is not certainty, but patience. Some questions remain open, not because researchers lack imagination, but because imagination must remain secondary to what the material can support. A theory that explains everything except one stubborn detail must still pause for that detail. Archaeology is full of these moments when a small inconsistency refuses to be smoothed away and forces the entire explanation to slow, revise, and sometimes stop altogether. The past does not rush to meet our expectations. Generations can pass while a question remains unresolved, not because progress stalls, but because new tools must be invented before old problems can be approached again. Techniques that seem ordinary now, microscopic residue analysis, isotopic tracing, ground penetrating imaging, did not exist for most of the field's history. A discovery examined decades ago can become new again when technology catches up to curiosity. The question waits, unchanged, while methods quietly evolve around it. There is also the simple reality that much of the past was made from fragile things: wood, fiber, skin, spoken words. These leave faint signatures, or none at all. What survives is often stone, metal, fired clay, the durable leftovers of daily life. Entire systems of knowledge may have depended on materials that vanished almost completely. When these disappear, transitions vanish with them. A technology can appear to arrive suddenly, not because it emerged fully formed, but because its earlier steps were made of things the earth did not keep. So when science says it does not know, it is not stepping away from truth. It is standing closer to it. Close enough to see complexity instead of comfort. Close enough to resist filling silence with certainty. In archaeology, unanswered questions are not failures waiting to be solved. They are reminders that the past was lived once, briefly, by real people whose choices left only partial shadows behind. Some of those shadows sharpen with time, others remain softly out of focus, not because they are empty, but because they are honest. The sea has a way of keeping secrets softly. It covers them in darkness, presses them flat with water and years, and lets memory thin until only shape and weight remain. Off the rocky edge of a small Greek island, the seafloor held one such secret for centuries, resting among the ribs of a wrecked ship, scattered amphorae, and the quiet trace of a journey interrupted. When divers first brought fragments of it into the light, it did not announce itself as extraordinary. Corrosion had reduced it to greened lumps, bronze fused with time, its edges softened and broken. It looked like debris, no different from countless other objects pulled from ancient waters. Only later, when the fragments were cleaned and turned beneath careful hands, did something unfamiliar begin to emerge. Inside the bronze were teeth, not the organic kind, but precise, evenly spaced cuts, interlocking in a way rarely seen outside much later centuries. Gears nested within gears, each aligned to move another. The shape suggested intention, calculation, motion measured rather than guessed. This was not decoration, it was a working system. As more pieces were examined, a strange picture formed. The object had once been housed in a wooden frame, now gone, its outline inferred only from surviving metal. Bronze dials had been etched with markings, faint inscriptions that hinted at cycles rather than decoration. When reconstructed slowly, patiently, the mechanism revealed a talent that felt almost out of place in its time. This machine could track the sky, not by watching it directly, but by translating the movements of distant bodies into turning wheels and predictable rotations. The rising and setting of the sun, the looping path of the moon, the shifting rhythm of eclipses, all of these could be anticipated by the quiet cooperation of metal parts hidden inside a box small enough to carry. Time itself, or at least humanity's attempt to follow it, had been folded into bronze. The craftsmanship required was not casual. Each gear had to be cut with care, its teeth shaped to precise ratios. A single error would ripple through the system, throwing every prediction out of alignment. This demanded not only skill, but a deep understanding of how cycles repeat and how motion can represent thought. It was mathematics made solid. What unsettled researchers was not simply that such a device existed, but that it stood alone. For more than 1,000 years after it was made, nothing comparable appears in the archaeological record. Simpler mechanisms surface, fragments of clocks and instruments, but nothing with this density of interlocking motion, nothing with this layered complexity. It was as if a chapter had been written, then quietly erased. The mechanism did not feel experimental. It did not resemble a first attempt or a crude prototype. It carried the confidence of something refined through experience, and yet no earlier examples survive. No trail of gradually improving versions appears in workshops or shipwrecks. The past around it remains quiet, leaving this machine suspended, complete yet unaccompanied. Its presence reshapes the silence around it. It suggests that ancient hands could work metal with a delicacy often underestimated, that knowledge could be encoded mechanically long before the era usually credited with such ingenuity. It hints at conversations between astronomy, craftsmanship, and philosophy that left few traces beyond this one dense object. Still, the mechanism does not shout. It does not demand a rewriting of everything that came before. Instead, it rests calmly within its fragments, offering what it offers and no more. It functions as evidence rather than argument, a reminder that progress does not always move in straight lines, and that human understanding can rise, settle, and sometimes disappear from view. In the end, the Antikythera mechanism feels less like an intrusion into history and more like a quiet survivor, carried across the sea, lost to a storm, sealed in darkness, and returned slowly to the surface. It speaks without urgency. It turns its gears only in the imagination now, marking a time when knowledge took a form we did not expect and waited patiently to be noticed again. As the mechanism settles into our understanding, another quiet absence begins to take shape around it. Not an absence of material, but of lineage. Most objects left behind by history arrive with echoes. A rough beginning, an experimental phase, a series of adjustments written into earlier forms. But this machine stands without that gentle prelude. It arrives complete, confident, and alone. There is no visible mechanical ancestry leading up to it, no scattered workshops filled with half-formed gears, no simpler devices that show the same idea taking its first uncertain steps. Earlier societies left behind tools that grow gradually more refined, stone improving to metal, edges sharpening over time. Mechanical thinking usually follows a similar rhythm, starting with single motions before learning to coordinate many. Yet here, the rhythm is missing. The music begins in the middle of the song. The mechanism does not resemble a sudden inspiration carved from ignorance. Its parts work together with practiced harmony. Ratios align. Movements are predicted rather than guessed. The bronze teeth fit closely enough to suggest experience in making them. This implies prior knowledge, but that knowledge does not survive alongside the object. The past, in this case, refuses to leave footprints. Equally quiet is the absence of instruction. No tablets describe its design. No papyrus scrolls outline its purpose in careful diagrams. Ancient texts speak of astronomy and mathematics with lyrical confidence, yet they do not pause to explain how metal might be persuaded to think in circles. Knowledge, it seems, traveled lightly, passed from hand to hand, spoken rather than written, trusted to memory, which is far more fragile than bronze. The lack of blueprints is not entirely unusual for antiquity. Many crafts relied on apprenticeship rather than manuals. Skills were embedded in movement, in repetition, in the muscle memory of trained hands. When those hands disappear, their methods can vanish with them. What remains is the final object, separated from the learning that shaped it. The Antikythera mechanism may be one of these rare survivors, an artifact that outlived the tradition that gave it meaning. There is also the matter of loss. Fires swept libraries, empires fractured, workshops closed quietly as trade routes shifted and resources thinned. Metal was melted down, reused, reshaped for new needs. Complex devices made from valuable bronze would not remain untouched for long. If similar mechanisms once existed, they may have been dismantled without ceremony, their parts returned to circulation, their purpose dissolved into usefulness. The sea, in this case, acted as an accidental archive. By claiming the ship and sealing its contents away, saltwater preserved what land might not. Corrosion slowed time. Isolation protected complexity. The mechanism survived not because it was celebrated, but because it was forgotten. This absence changes how the object is read. Instead of being an endpoint of progress, it becomes a fragment of a conversation interrupted. It suggests that knowledge can rise to remarkable heights without leaving a long shadow behind. That invention does not always spread outward evenly. Sometimes it concentrates in one place, at one moment, and then fades. What makes this absence the true mystery is not the impossibility of invention, but the silence that follows it. Humanity is often imagined as climbing steadily upward, each generation inheriting the tools of the last. The mechanism challenges this idea gently. It implies that advancement can be local, that brilliance does not guarantee continuity, that understanding, once achieved, can still be lost. This does not diminish the people who created it. If anything, it brings them closer. It places them within a world where knowledge depended on fragile systems of teaching and transmission, where wars, storms, and simple misfortune could erase entire crafts. Their achievement becomes more human, not less, shaped by circumstance as much as insight. In the end, the Antikythera mechanism carries its missing past with it, like a shadow that cannot quite be seen. It reminds us that archaeology is not only about what is found, but about what never reaches us. The object remains solid, measurable, and real. Its history, however, thins as it stretches backward, and in that thinning space, the quiet mystery lives. Long before villages settled into fields and seasons were measured by harvest, the land itself held a gathering place of stone. On a gentle rise in what is now southeastern Anatolia, a hill concealed something carefully arranged, patiently waiting beneath layers of soil and time. When it emerged, it did not arrive loudly. It did not overturn the past in a rush. Instead, it adjusted the ground beneath our understanding, slowly and quietly. Gobekli Tepe belongs to a world far older than the stone circles of Britain and the Great Pyramids rising along the Nile. Its age places it deep in the early chapters of settled human memory, at a time when people moved with the seasons, following animals, gathering plants, and returning again and again to familiar landscapes. This was not a society shaped by agriculture or permanent towns. It was shaped by movement, by shared knowledge carried in stories rather than stored in buildings. And yet, here stood monuments. Great pillars of limestone were raised from the bedrock, some taller than a grown person standing on another's shoulders. They were cut, shaped, and positioned with care, forming circles and enclosures that repeat a clear design. Each pillar was smoothed and carved, its surface marked with reliefs of animals and symbols that feel deliberate rather than decorative. Foxes, snakes, birds, and abstract forms glide across the stone as if caught mid-motion, frozen in a language without words. The weight of these stones is difficult to ignore. They are not casual offerings. They required planning, coordination, and sustained effort over time. Quarries were opened nearby, tools were carried, teams organized, labor repeated across seasons. All of this occurred without evidence of farming, without draft animals, and without the permanent settlements once thought necessary to support such work. What rises from the site is not just stone, but intention. These structures were not homes, they were not defensive walls or storage spaces. They were built for gathering, for ritual, for shared meaning that demanded more than temporary shelter. The effort invested suggests that belief, or something very close to it, mattered deeply enough to reshape the landscape. The carvings speak quietly of a symbolic world already well formed. The animals do not appear randomly, they repeat, return, and arrange themselves in ways that hint at stories understood by those who came here. The pillars themselves are shaped almost like human figures, with arms carved along their sides and hands meeting at the front. They stand upright, watching, as if the space was meant to be occupied by presence rather than absence. This challenges an older assumption about the order of human development. For a long time, it was believed that farming made monuments possible, that surplus food created time, and time allowed for art, ritual, and architecture. Gobekli Tepe suggests a more tangled story. Here, collective meaning may have come first. The desire to gather, to mark something larger than survival, may have drawn people together long before crops anchored them in place. The site was not used forever. After generations of activity, the enclosures were intentionally filled in. Stone by stone, soil was returned, covering the pillars as if closing a chapter. This was not collapse or abandonment in panic. It was measured, careful, and complete. The reason remains softly out of reach, another reminder that actions can be purposeful without leaving explanations behind. Gobekli Tepe does not stand as a mistake in the record. It stands as an expansion. It shows that complex social behavior does not require the structures we once believed essential. It shows that imagination, cooperation, and shared symbols can precede fields and fences, that humans, even while moving lightly across the land, were capable of shaping places meant to last far beyond a single lifetime. As the stones settle back into silence, they continue to hold their weight, not as a challenge to science, but as an invitation to widen its frame. The past, it seems, was already more thoughtful, more organized, and more symbol-rich than we once allowed ourselves to see. Once the stones of Gobekli Tepe are allowed to settle in the mind, a quieter challenge begins to surface, not one of belief or symbolism, but of organization. The site asks not only why it was built, but how such an effort came together at all. Beneath the carved animals and towering pillars lies a problem of coordination that reshapes how early society is understood. The limestone did not arrive by chance. It was quarried directly from the ridge, cut free from living rock with tools of stone and bone. Each pillar began as part of the hill itself, traced, scored, and separated through patient repetition. The work demanded an understanding of fracture and force, of how rock responds to pressure applied again and again in the same place. This knowledge was practical, learned through hands, not written instruction. Once freed, the stone had to be moved. These pillars weighed many tons, far beyond what a single group could lift. The landscape offers no easy slopes, no natural channels that would have carried the weight along. Movement required planning, timing, and shared effort. Ropes fashioned from plant fibers, wooden levers cut from nearby trees, rollers shaped and replaced as they wore down. Progress would have been slow, measured in careful steps rather than speed. This kind of labor cannot be sustained casually. It asks for schedules aligned across families and seasons. People had to gather at the same time, return repeatedly, and commit energy that might otherwise be spent on hunting or foraging. Food had to be shared, tasks divided, experience remembered from one season to the next. None of this resembles a temporary camp driven by immediate need. What is striking is that all of this unfolded without agriculture. There were no fields to anchor people permanently to one place, no stored harvests to guarantee surplus. Instead, cooperation itself became the stabilizing force. The site suggests that social organization did not wait patiently for farming to appear. It emerged alongside belief, ritual, and shared purpose, drawing people together long before fences or granaries defined community. The construction of the enclosures would have required leadership, but not necessarily hierarchy as later societies understood it. Coordination could arise through tradition, through obligation, through shared meaning reinforced over time. People returned because the place mattered and because others returned too. The structure of the work reflects a society capable of collective focus without rigid control. Each enclosure followed a recognizable pattern, which implies memory and planning extending beyond a single generation. Knowledge persisted, instructions were remembered, mistakes were corrected. This continuity suggests that ideas themselves were being passed down, along with the skills to carry them out. Culture, here, acted as infrastructure. For archaeologists, this posed a quiet disruption. Earlier models often placed complex organization after the adoption of farming, once food surpluses allowed for specialists and long-term projects. Gobekli Tepe reverses that sequence gently but firmly. It shows a society capable of sustaining large-scale coordination while still living within a foraging economy. The implication is not that early people were secretly modern, but that complexity wears many forms. Organization does not require writing. Planning does not require permanent buildings. Commitment does not require fields. Human groups, even while moving with the landscape, could assemble themselves around shared goals that extended far beyond survival. This realization reshapes the past without breaking it. It replaces a single ladder of progress with a branching path. Different societies discovered different ways to cooperate, depending on environment, belief, and opportunity. Gobekli Tepe represents one of those paths, where meaning itself became the force that held people together long enough to move stone. As the site continues to be studied, the organizational problem remains central, not because it lacks answers, but because the answers resist simplicity. Coordination emerged here without the tools once assumed necessary. Structure appeared before settlement. Purpose came before permanence. In the quiet space between stone and soil, Gobekli Tepe continues to remind us that early society was not waiting to become complex. In its own way, it already was. After the wide coordination of people and time comes something smaller, quieter, and in many ways more unsettling. The individual meeting points between stones, the places where one surface presses against another, leaving no space for chance. Across several ancient sites, blocks rest together with a closeness that seems almost intimate, as if they were poured into place rather than set by human hands. These stones do not rely on mortar. There is no binding paste filling the gaps, no soft material correcting uneven edges. Instead, the blocks meet directly, face to face, their surfaces shaped until the contact is complete. Light struggles to pass between them. A blade finds no opening. The joints hold steady not because something glues them together, but because they agree with each other completely. The shaping required for this kind of fit is immense. Stone does not forgive impatience. Every strike removes material that cannot be returned. To reach this level of precision, surfaces must be approached gradually, tested again and again, adjusted by fractions almost too small to see. The work asks for a steady memory of form and hands trained to feel difference rather than measure it. What makes this precision so striking is not only the result, but the context in which it appeared. These surfaces were finished without metal saws spinning at speed, without powered grinders humming through the rock. The tools available were simpler: stone hammers, harder stones used as abrasives, copper edges softened by repeated use. Progress would have been slow, guided by touch and sound rather than numbers. Stone gives feedback quietly. A tap rings differently when a surface begins to settle. A scrape smooths into silence as friction fades. Craftspeople working this way learn to listen to material rather than force it. The precision was not rushed, it was coaxed. In many cases, the stones themselves were large enough that even moving them was a challenge, yet their contact surfaces were treated with the same care as fine sculpture. Curves meet curves. Angles resolve into stability. The weight of the blocks presses downward, locking them tighter as centuries pass. The structures grow more secure with time, not weaker. Modern observers often assume that such results require modern instruments, but precision does not always mean speed or automation. It can emerge from repetition and familiarity, from generations passing down techniques refined slowly. A tolerance tight enough to defy expectation can be achieved when nothing is hidden behind filler or correction. Every surface must be honest, because every surface is exposed. The absence of mortar also suggests confidence. There is no allowance for settling later, no space for adjustment after placement. Each block must arrive already knowing its role. This indicates planning far beyond the moment of construction. Stones had to be shaped with their final position in mind, sometimes before neighboring pieces were finished. The image of chaotic building gives way to something far more deliberate. What unsettles archaeology is not that ancient people were capable of precision, but that they achieved it repeatedly, across distant regions and long spans of time, without leaving behind the intermediate steps we expect to see: the gradual rough versions, the experiments that fail, the abandoned attempts. Instead, the work often appears assured, as if the method was already mature. This does not mean the knowledge was mysterious or lost to reason. It means the knowledge lived differently. It resided in practice rather than instruction, in hands rather than texts. When those hands stopped working stone, the knowledge dissolved with them. What remains are the finished surfaces, still holding together, still asking for attention without explanation. Precision stonework does not announce itself loudly. It reveals itself slowly, when the eye rests long enough to notice how little space exists between things. It asks for patience from those who study it, mirroring the patience that once shaped it. As shadows lengthen across these ancient walls, the stones continue their quiet agreement. They remain pressed together, unchanged, carrying forward a reminder that skill does not always leave a clear trail behind it. Sometimes it leaves only the calm certainty of a perfect fit. As attention lingers on the finished stone, it naturally drifts backward toward the hands that shaped it, not toward imagined devices or hidden machines, but toward what can be confirmed quietly through marks left behind and materials recovered nearby. The toolkits associated with these works are modest, almost austere: stone, shaped against stone; copper, softened and sharpened again and again; nothing hardened by steel, nothing driven by engines or gears, only human effort, applied patiently. The stones themselves preserve this story. Close inspection reveals faint striations, shallow grooves, and subtle abrasion patterns that speak of repeated contact rather than forceful cuts. These are not the scars of high-speed tools. They are the slow signatures of grinding, pecking, scraping, and polishing. A surface shaped not by power, but by persistence. Stone tools are unforgiving companions. They dull quickly, they fracture without warning, their edges must be renewed constantly, sometimes reshaped entirely during the course of a single task. Using them well requires intimate familiarity with material. The craftsperson must feel when a tool begins to fail, listen to the sound it makes against the rock, adjust pressure by instinct rather than measurement. Progress arrives a grain at a time. Copper tools add another layer to this quiet picture. Copper is workable, but it is soft. It bends, blunts, and deforms long before it cuts deeply. When pressed against hard stone, it does not slice so much as guide abrasive particles held between tool and surface. Sand, crushed stone, and water become part of the tool itself. Cutting becomes a partnership between hand and material, a slow wearing away rather than a decisive separation. There is no evidence of steel at these sites, no hardened edges capable of biting cleanly into rock, no alloys strong enough to transform speed into efficiency. This absence matters because it defines the tempo of work. Without steel, nothing moves quickly. Surfaces must be approached cautiously. Every adjustment carries the risk of irreversibility. There is also no trace of powered cutting, no circular marks, no consistent rotational scars, no signs of mechanical assistance beyond gravity, leverage, and muscle. Movement is human scale. Energy arrives through bodies working together, through rhythm and repetition, through time invested rather than energy multiplied. What survives in the archaeological record aligns with this picture. Hammerstones, chisels, polishing stones, simple forms, worn smooth through use. No tool suggests a shortcut. No object points clearly toward a missing category of advanced equipment, and yet the results remain. This is where explanation grows careful and contested. The question is not whether these tools could shape stone. They clearly did. The question rests in scale and consistency. Achieving one precise joint is possible through patience. Achieving thousands across a site implies systems of training, shared standards, and long experience. The tools explain the method, but not always the organization behind it. Some researchers emphasize time as the primary ingredient, generations working the same materials, refining techniques through practice rather than innovation. Skill deepens as familiarity grows. Precision becomes cultural, passed down not as instruction but as habit. Others point to specialization. Not everyone shaped stone. Certain individuals or groups may have focused entirely on this craft, accumulating knowledge that rarely spread beyond their circle. When such specialists disappear, the knowledge narrows and vanishes with them. Environmental context also matters. Stone behaves differently depending on temperature, moisture, and mineral composition. Local materials may have been unusually cooperative, responding more predictably to abrasion and pressure. What seems difficult elsewhere may have felt manageable here, given enough time and familiarity. Because none of these explanations exclude the others, debate continues. The evidence supports patience, skill, and repetition. It resists single answers. The tools themselves remain humble, almost quiet in their simplicity, while the stone they shaped continues to hold its improbable calm. In the end, what is known does not diminish what remains uncertain. It anchors it. The story does not drift into speculation. It stays grounded in what hands could hold and bodies could carry. Stone against stone, copper against grit, time against patience. The marks remain where they were left, steady and unhurried. They remind us that complexity does not always arrive with complexity in tools. Sometimes it grows slowly, through ordinary means, guided by hands that understood their work deeply enough to let the stone decide the pace. The story drifts forward into an age when ink and parchment had begun to travel farther than stone ever could. Ships crossed seas with growing confidence, compasses steadied direction, and coastlines were no longer rumors passed between harbors, but lines carefully traced by those who had seen them. From this world came a map, assembled quietly, with a patience that matched the rhythm of the waves that carried its knowledge. Its maker, Piri Reis, lived during the early years of the 16th century when the edges of the known world were stretching outward but still uneven. He did not claim invention. He spoke instead of gathering. His map was a mosaic, drawn together from fragments of older charts, sailors' accounts, and documents already worn by time. Some of these sources belonged to recent voyages. Others reached back much further, their original authors unnamed and long gone. What survives today is only a portion of the original work, a fragment that escaped loss by chance rather than intention. Yet even in its incomplete state, it carries a quiet weight. Coastlines curve with an assurance that feels measured rather than guessed. Bays open where they should. Distances breathe with proportional balance. Land meets sea in ways that feel familiar to modern eyes, even though the tools behind it were far from modern. The map reflects a world understood through accumulation rather than single discovery. Each source layered gently atop another, corrected, adjusted, and aligned where agreement emerged. Errors were not erased completely, but softened through comparison. Accuracy, in this sense, was communal, born from many journeys rather than one commanding view. What unsettles careful readers is how well some of these coastlines align with shores charted centuries later. Shapes appear that match regions known today, with a closeness that seems to exceed expectations for its time. This does not suggest impossible knowledge, but it does suggest persistence. Information, once gathered, does not vanish easily. It drifts, copied and recopied, surviving political shifts and lost libraries, hiding in unexpected places. The map hints at a long memory of navigation, sailors noting angles of sun and stars, coast watchers marking capes and inlets, pilots carrying rolled charts stained with salt, updating them as routes repeated themselves. Knowledge moved through hands, not institutions. It remained flexible, adapting as seas changed and harbors shifted. Importantly, this accuracy does not stand alone. It rests beside areas that are less certain, where lines wander or proportions soften. The map does not pretend to perfection. It offers what it has honestly, showing where information gathered densely and where it thinned. This unevenness strengthens its credibility. It reads like a working document, not a proclamation. What matters most is not how much the map knew, but how it knew it. The map represents the survival of information across generations that did not always preserve it cleanly. Wars intervened, empires fell, languages changed. Yet the practical needs of travel kept certain details alive. Routes that worked were remembered, shores that saved ships were redrawn, mistakes that cost lives were corrected carefully. The Piri Reis map reminds archaeology that paper can be as archaeological as stone, that lines drawn by hand can carry histories just as complex as monuments carved from rock. It shows that some forms of knowledge are remarkably resilient, even when their origins fade. This does not require lost civilizations or vanished sciences. It requires patience, repetition, and respect for observation. The sea teaches those who listen carefully. Maps grow wiser the longer they are used. As the parchment settles back into quiet storage, its lines still curve gently across imagined water. They do not shout revelation. They simply persist, carrying forward the echo of many hands, many voyages, and many careful acts of remembering. As the map continues to rest between centuries, its calm surface hides a persistent unease. Not an argument born of doubt, but of careful attention. The lines invite study, and with study comes disagreement. Not because the map is flawed, but because it sits at the intersection of many systems that do not quite align. One source of debate lies in projection, the quiet problem of translating a curved world onto a flat surface. Even today, this task carries compromise. Shapes stretch, distances bend, directions favor some regions while distorting others. In the early 16th century, cartographers worked without a single standard way to unfold the globe. They relied on approximations, experience, and inherited conventions. Coastlines drawn from different perspectives had to be persuaded to live together on one sheet, even when their original logic disagreed. This creates subtle tensions within the map. Some regions appear compressed, others widened. Angles feel slightly off in places, not because the coast was misunderstood, but because the method of flattening the world pulled it gently out of shape. When modern eyes compare these sections against contemporary maps, alignment improves in some areas and falters in others. The disagreement lives in the translation, not necessarily in the observation itself. Another layer of uncertainty rests in the sources used to compile the map. It was assembled from many older documents, each carrying its own history and limitations. Some were copied multiple times, errors introduced with each hand. Others came from sailors who measured by eye and memory, rather than instrument. When these sources overlapped, their agreements strengthened confidence. When they conflicted, decisions had to be made about which to trust. This process leaves behind a faint fingerprint of judgment. Certain coastlines suggest reliance on one tradition, while others echo a different lineage of charts. The map becomes less like a photograph and more like a conversation, with multiple voices speaking at once. Untangling which voice came from where is difficult, especially when the originals no longer survive. Navigation itself adds another constraint. At the time, determining latitude was manageable through the height of stars or the sun. Longitude was a far more uncertain matter. Without reliable timekeeping, east and west positions were often estimated through dead reckoning, counting hours sailed and correcting for currents by instinct. Small errors accumulated over long distances, stretching or compressing space in ways that were invisible to those drawing the map, but noticeable later. This uneven precision explains why coastal outlines can feel confident while distances between them feel uncertain. Sailors knew when land appeared, how it curved as they followed it, where harbors opened and closed. They were less certain about how far they had traveled to reach it. The map preserves this balance, strong where experience was direct, softer where inference took over. The debate persists because none of these explanations exclude the others. Projection, source blending, and navigational limits all leave traces that overlap. Separating them cleanly is rarely possible. Each attempt to resolve one issue reveals another layer beneath it. The map resists simple classification, remaining neither inexplicably advanced nor naively flawed. What keeps discussion alive is not the suggestion of impossibility, but the reminder of complexity. Knowledge in this period was not centralized. It moved through ports and across decks, carried by people whose lives depended on remembering what worked. Maps were tools first, intellectual objects second. They evolved through use, not theory. As a result, the map holds together unevenly, like memory itself. Some details sharpen with time, others blur. This unevenness does not weaken it, it makes it human. The argument continues quietly, across desks and studies, not because the map defies reason, but because it rewards patience. It asks to be understood within its own context, shaped by the limits and strengths of its age. And in that steady refusal to resolve cleanly, it mirrors the past it depicts. Not a fixed image, but a shifting one, carried forward by careful hands and thoughtful disagreement. The story turns from coastlines and stone toward something lighter, quieter, and yet just as resistant to certainty. A book. Not large, not ornate, not announced by gold or proclamation. It rests instead in the space between pages, ink and patience, carrying a weight that does not come from mass, but from refusal. The Voynich manuscript has been carbon dated to the early 1400s, placing its parchment firmly within a known human moment. The animal skin from which its pages were made lived, breathed, and was prepared centuries ago. Time has verified that much with calm authority. The book itself belongs to the medieval world, even if its contents remain distant from it. Open its pages, and the first impression is order. Lines run evenly. Margins are respected. The hand that wrote it was steady and practiced. The script flows with rhythm, repeating characters that appear again and again, forming clusters that feel intentional rather than random. This is not a chaotic scrawl. It reads like a language that knows itself. Yet no one has been able to read it. The symbols do not correspond cleanly to any known alphabet. They repeat with patterns that suggest grammar, spacing that resembles words, and distributions that echo natural language rather than cipher or noise. Some characters appear only at the beginnings of lines, others cluster toward the middle. Some combinations feel favored, others avoided. All of this implies structure shaped by habit and understanding. Alongside the text are illustrations, plants that resemble nothing exactly, yet feel assembled from familiar parts. Roots twist unnaturally, leaves repeat in strange symmetry. Flowers bloom in arrangements that do not exist in fields or forests. There are diagrams of stars, circular charts, bathing figures, flowing tubes, and interconnected forms that resist singular interpretation. The drawings are careful, deliberate, and consistent in style. The manuscript does not behave like a hoax. Creating such internal consistency would require extraordinary discipline, sustained over hundreds of pages, without a single slip into known language or recognizable cipher. Statistical analysis reinforces this sense of authenticity. The text carries the subtle irregularities expected of human communication, the uneven frequency, the preference for certain structures. the quiet inefficiencies that emerge when meaning guides form. Over the years, many approaches have been applied. Linguists, cryptographers, historians, computer scientists. Each brings a new lens, a new patience, and sets it gently against the text. Patterns are mapped, hypotheses are tested. Some collapse quickly, others linger. None unlock the whole. Part of the difficulty lies in the absence of context. There is no confirmed author, no accompanying letter, no reference that anchors the manuscript to a known place or purpose. It arrives alone, without explanatory debris. Without that grounding, even correct partial insights struggle to connect into a complete understanding. The book may represent a natural language now lost, or a specialized notation tied to a tradition that did not survive. It may encode practical knowledge, medical, botanical, astronomical, wrapped in symbols familiar to a small group and meaningless outside it. Or it may sit at the boundary between several systems, borrowing from each without belonging fully to any. What remains consistent is the sense that intention is present on every page. Someone took the time to create this. Someone cared enough to complete it. Someone expected it to be read, even if only by a few. The manuscript does not behave like a puzzle built to impress. It behaves like a working object, confident in its own purpose. Time has not softened it into myth. The parchment is real. The ink is real. The statistical properties are real. What is absent is not evidence, but alignment. The pieces exist, but they do not settle into a single picture. The Voynich manuscript occupies a rare space. It is not unexplored. It is thoroughly examined. It is not dismissed. It is preserved, studied, and returned to again and again with new methods and renewed quiet attention. Its mystery persists not because it defies science, but because it has not yet found the frame that fits it. As the pages close, the book returns to stillness. Its symbols rest where they have always rested, unchanged by the centuries that pass over them. It does not ask to be solved. It simply remains, written in a voice that once belonged to someone, somewhere, and now waits calmly for understanding to arrive, if it ever does. After the manuscript is opened and examined, after its pages are turned under careful light, the difficulty does not come from chaos, but from order. The text does not dissolve under scrutiny, it tightens. Patterns repeat with a steadiness that refuses to behave like chance. The symbols arrange themselves as if guided by habit, by rules learned and followed over time. When scholars look closely at the distribution of characters, they find something familiar in its rhythm. Certain symbols appear often, others rarely. Some prefer the beginnings of lines, others settle toward the middle. The spacing between clusters is uneven in a way that mirrors spoken language, not artificial codes. This balance between repetition and variation is difficult to fake. It emerges naturally when meaning guides expression, and it is notoriously hard to reproduce deliberately without errors creeping in. The manuscript structure behaves like language that has been used, not invented for display. Word lengths follow a narrow range, neither wildly inconsistent nor mechanically uniform. Patterns repeat across distant sections of the book, suggesting memory rather than improvisation. The text seems to know what it has already said and what it is allowed to say again. Beneath this surface, deeper regularities appear. Certain symbols almost always follow others. Some combinations never occur at all. This quiet order resembles grammar, the invisible framework that shapes communication without announcing itself. Grammar does not need to be explained to be followed. It settles into habit, guiding hands as they write, shaping sentences before thought arrives. These consistencies hold even when the content shifts. Whether the surrounding illustrations suggest plants, stars, or human figures, the text retains its internal logic. The system does not loosen or tighten dramatically. It remains itself. That continuity argues against randomness and equally against simple substitution ciphers, which tend to flatten variation rather than preserve it. Attempts to read the manuscript as a hoax struggle under this weight. Creating hundreds of pages that sustain such statistical balance would require not only immense effort, but an understanding of linguistic structure that was not formally articulated at the time. Even modern attempts to fabricate similar texts often reveal themselves through subtle regularities that feel too clean, too even, too intentional. The Voynich text, by contrast, carries imperfections that feel lived in. A hoax usually aims for an audience. It gestures toward recognition or reaction. This manuscript does neither. It does not include obvious jokes, signatures, or self-reference. It does not resolve into a trick once patience is applied. It simply continues, page after page, confident in its own coherence. The illustrations reinforce this sense of sincerity. They align with the text spatially and thematically, yet they do not translate it directly. They feel related, but not explanatory. This suggests a shared understanding between text and image, an internal logic accessible to its intended readers but opaque to outsiders. That relationship is consistent across the manuscript, another quiet sign of purpose rather than performance. Part of the resistance to decoding may lie in missing context rather than missing intelligence. Languages do not exist in isolation. They lean on culture, environment, shared reference. Remove those supports, and even familiar systems can become unreadable. The manuscript arrives stripped of that scaffolding. Without knowing who wrote it, who read it, or why it was needed, even correct guesses struggle to connect. It is also possible that the manuscript sits between categories. It may combine language with shorthand, symbolism with notation, meaning with memory aids meant for a specific group. In such systems, readability depends on training rather than translation. Without that training, the text remains closed, not by intention, but by circumstance. What keeps the manuscript from yielding is not stubbornness, but completeness. It does not offer loose threads easily pulled. Every pattern discovered leads to another layer rather than a solution. Each advance clarifies the structure while leaving meaning just beyond reach. This endurance gives the manuscript a rare kind of presence. It has been examined intensely, returned to again and again, and still it rests where it always has, internally consistent, externally silent. It does not fail under analysis. It simply remains itself. In this way, the Voynich manuscript does not resist decoding through mystery alone, but through integrity. Its patterns hold, its structure persists, and until context returns or a new key is found, it continues to speak only to itself, calmly intact across centuries that have tried, patiently, to listen. From ink and parchment, the story sinks downward into the earth itself, away from sunlight, away from wind and weather, into a landscape shaped not by erosion or accident, but by sustained human effort carried out in silence. Beneath the rolling land of eastern China lies a network of spaces so vast and deliberate that they feel less like caves and more like hidden architecture. The Longyou caves were revealed only when water was drained away, exposing chambers that had been sealed and forgotten for centuries. One by one, these underground halls emerged, each carved deeply into solid rock. The scale is difficult to absorb at first. Caverns open wide enough to swallow buildings, their ceilings sloping upward in clean planes, their walls descending smoothly into shadow. These are not natural formations. Every surface bears the same signature. Parallel chisel marks run at steady angles across walls, ceilings, and columns, as if a single hand or a single shared method guided the work throughout the entire complex. The markings are uniform in depth and spacing, repeating endlessly, patiently, without interruption. They do not vary with height or difficulty. They do not hesitate at corners or curves. They suggest planning extended over long stretches of time. The caves are not small. Each required the removal of thousands of tons of stone, yet no piles of debris surround their entrances. No spoil heaps remain nearby. The rock did not simply vanish, but whatever became of it left no clear trace. The work was done carefully enough to preserve structural balance. Pillars remain standing, precisely angled to hold the weight above. Roofs slope gently to prevent collapse. Drainage paths appear intentional, guiding moisture away rather than allowing it to weaken the stone. Despite this immense effort, the historical record stays quiet. No official documents mention the excavation. No inscriptions name the builders. No local chronicles celebrate the accomplishment or even acknowledge it. The caves exist almost entirely outside written memory, known only through their physical presence and the discipline implied by their walls. This absence is as striking as the caves themselves. Large projects usually leave echoes. They require labor, resources, coordination, and time. They shape economies and demand leadership. And yet, here, silence follows stone. The caves sit beneath the land without context, their purpose inferred but not confirmed. Speculation remains restrained. Some chambers suggest storage, others feel ceremonial, open and spacious in ways that do not prioritize efficiency. The caves do not all serve the same apparent function, yet they share the same technique, the same hand language carved into rock. Whatever their use, it was consistent enough to be repeated and important enough to justify extraordinary labor. The uniformity of the carving is especially revealing. Different workers usually leave subtle differences in style. Variations creep in through fatigue, preference, or habit. Here, those differences are muted. The marks align so closely that they suggest rigorous training, shared standards, and careful oversight. This was not casual digging, it was practiced craft. The stone itself carries no decoration, no figures, no symbols. It offers only texture and geometry. This restraint gives the caves a quiet dignity. They were not meant to impress through ornament, but through space, through the experience of scale and depth, of moving through corridors shaped by intention rather than erosion. What remains hardest to explain is not how the caves were carved, but why they were forgotten so completely. Knowledge of such an undertaking usually persists, even if its purpose fades. Oral tradition, local legend, something. In this case, even memory seems to have drained away, leaving only rock. This does not suggest mystery in the sense of lost civilizations or hidden technologies. It suggests fragility. Human achievement depends not only on creation, but on continuity. When that chain breaks, even monumental efforts can slip quietly out of awareness. The Longyou caves now rest as they always have, below ground, steady and cool. They do not declare their story. They allow themselves to be observed, measured, and contemplated. Their walls still hold the marks of patient hands, repeating a motion whose meaning has thinned with time. In that stillness, the caves remind archaeology that absence is not emptiness. It is information shaped by loss. The stone remains. The silence around it speaks just as clearly. Once the chambers themselves have been absorbed, another presence begins to assert itself. Not stone, not space, but time. Time measured not in years, but in sustained human effort layered one careful motion upon another. The scale of excavation beneath the earth forces the imagination to slow down, to follow the rhythm of work rather than the speed of explanation. Each chamber demanded thousands of repeated actions: strike, chip, clear, again and again. Rock yields reluctantly, and only to patience. Even with skilled hands, progress would have been measured in small advances, the wall retreating by fractions with each day's labor. There were no shortcuts hidden in the stone. Every surface reflects time invested deliberately. When researchers estimate the volume of material removed, the numbers grow heavy quickly. Not because they are astonishing on paper, but because they represent countless hours of human life devoted to a task with no immediate reward. These were not shelters carved in haste. They were not mines opened for urgency. The effort stretched across seasons, perhaps across generations, returning again and again to the same dark spaces beneath the land. Such work cannot be sustained by individuals acting alone. It requires coordination, shared schedules, and reliable cooperation. Groups had to arrive together, work together, and leave together. Tasks would have been divided. Some cut, some carried, some maintained tools, others ensured that the space remained stable and safe. Knowledge passed quietly through demonstration rather than instruction. This coordination implies planning beyond the day. Labor had to be timed around planting, harvesting, travel, or other obligations. Food had to be available, injuries managed, motivation maintained. The caves do not reflect a single burst of enthusiasm. They reflect persistence, a decision made and then kept, even when the reward lay far beyond immediate sight. The mystery deepens when attention turns to what is missing. The stone removed from these chambers did not pile up nearby. No mounds of rubble mark the entrances. No clear dumping grounds remain in the surrounding landscape. The material did not simply dissolve, it had to go somewhere. One possibility is that the stone was used elsewhere, carried off gradually, and repurposed into foundations, walls, or infrastructure now eroded or buried. Another possibility is that it was transported farther away, dispersed slowly across the landscape in ways that blended into natural contours over time. Either way, removal would have added another layer of labor, doubling the effort required for every meter carved. This absence also speaks to intention. Debris was not treated as waste. It was managed, directed, and removed carefully enough to avoid leaving obvious scars behind. That suggests oversight, rules, and shared understanding of how the work should proceed. Disorder would have left traces. What remains instead is restraint. The scale problem, then, is not just one of volume, but of continuity. People return to the same plan repeatedly, honoring decisions made long before their own hands touch stone. This kind of persistence implies social structures capable of maintaining purpose across time, not enforced through monuments above ground, but upheld quietly through practice. Archaeology often seeks moments of origin, a first cut, a beginning point. Here, the beginning remains out of reach. What survives is the middle and the end, the work itself, complete enough to stand, yet detached from its first intention. The caves do not tell us when the decision was made to begin. They only show that once begun, it was not abandoned lightly. This challenges assumptions about early labor. Large projects are often associated with visible power, hierarchy, or spectacle. The caves suggest something subtler. They suggest collective discipline without display, work undertaken not to be seen, but to exist. As the light fades within these chambers, the stone holds its silence. The scale of effort remains etched into every surface, measurable not only in volume, but in devotion. Time passed here, slowly, deliberately, guided by hands that trusted the future enough to keep working in darkness. In that stillness, the scale problem settles into clarity. The caves were not carved quickly, they were carved patiently. And whatever their purpose, it was strong enough to hold people together long enough for stone to yield. The narrative rises gently from stone and parchment into open sky, settling over a dry plain where the earth itself became a canvas. In the coastal deserts of southern Peru, the ground stretches outward in muted reds and browns, its surface hardened by sun and scarcity. Rain is rare here, wind moves softly. For long periods, the land remains exactly as it was left. Across this quiet expanse lie markings so large that they dissolve when viewed from the ground. Lines run straight for great distances, unwavering, precise. Shapes unfold slowly, curves revealing animals, plants, and abstract forms only when distance allows the eye to gather them whole. From above, the desert transforms into a field of intention. These are the Nazca lines, enormous geoglyphs etched directly into the earth, created by removing the darker surface stones to reveal lighter soil beneath. The contrast is subtle but durable. With little weather to disturb them, the lines have endured, thin and steady, across centuries. What makes these figures remarkable is not just their size, but their perspective. Many are best understood from the air. From the ground, a single line appears ordinary, a shallow trench stretching ahead. Only when the land is seen from above does the coherence emerge, the curves of a bird, the long legs of a spider, the slow spiral of a shell. And yet, the people who made them did not fly. There is no evidence of aerial platforms, no devices capable of lifting observers high enough to see the full designs during their creation. The lines were drawn without the advantage of the viewpoint that makes them most legible. This alone demands a pause. The method itself was simple. Stones were cleared by hand, no cutting into bedrock, no heavy excavation. The work required planning rather than force. Stakes could be placed, cords stretched taut across the surface, points aligned by sight and memory. Progress would have been steady, quiet, and surprisingly efficient when repeated over time. Straight lines are among the most striking features. Some extend farther than the eye can easily follow, holding their direction with astonishing consistency. Maintaining such alignment over uneven terrain requires careful calibration, constant adjustment, and shared reference points. This was not casual wandering, it was deliberate geometry expressed through movement. The shapes themselves suggest intention beyond decoration. They are not crowded, they do not overlap randomly. Space is respected. Certain figures occupy their own territory, isolated yet connected through networks of lines that seem to bind the landscape into a larger pattern. Whether these connections held symbolic, ritual, or practical meaning remains open, but the coherence cannot be dismissed. What is often overlooked is the commitment required to create something that cannot be fully seen while it is being made. This is an act of trust. Trust in plan, trust in memory, trust that the meaning exists even when it is invisible. The makers worked knowing that the final form would reveal itself from a perspective they might never experience directly. This suggests a different relationship with space and time. Meaning did not depend on immediate visual confirmation. It depended on shared understanding, on stories that described the whole even when only a part was visible, on rituals or practices that unfolded across distance rather than proximity. The desert itself played a role. Its stability preserved the lines. Its openness allowed for long sight lines along the ground, even if the full image remained hidden. The environment became a collaborator, holding the work steady long after the hands that shaped it had left. The Nazca lines do not announce their purpose. They do not explain themselves. They simply remain, stretched across land and time, visible now through technologies that arrived long after their creation. Airplanes, satellites, and images captured far above finally show the drawings as complete forms, fulfilling a viewpoint that was never available to their makers. This does not diminish the achievement, it deepens it. The lines were made for a world understood differently, where meaning did not require direct observation, and where scale itself carried significance. They stand as reminders that humans have long thought beyond their immediate senses. As the desert settles into evening and shadows soften the edges of the land, the lines hold their course. They do not fade, they do not shift. They wait quietly, connecting ground and sky, intention and patience, offering a vision of human creativity that was never meant to rush and never needed to explain itself aloud. After the lines are traced and their scale absorbed, attention turns quietly toward meaning, not meaning as declaration, but meaning as use. What were these markings for, once the stones were cleared and the shapes set gently into the land? Over time, many explanations have gathered around them, each thoughtful, each grounded in evidence, and each incomplete. One path leads toward ritual. The desert was not empty to those who lived beside it. It was alive with forces that shaped survival, water, wind, fertility, and time itself. In this view, the lines become pathways of movement rather than images to be seen. Walking them may have mattered more than viewing them. Feet tracing long, straight routes across the plain, bodies moving in rhythm with ceremony, repetition turning space into experience. The figures could have acted as invitations, calling attention to particular places where meaning gathered more densely. Other interpretations draw the eye upward. Certain lines align with the rising or setting of the sun at key moments in the year. Some appear to point toward distant horizons, where celestial cycles marked seasons of planting or scarcity. In this light, the lines function as quiet instruments, embedded in the landscape rather than raised above it. The sky becomes readable through the ground itself, knowledge spread horizontally instead of vertically. There is also the idea of social signaling. The creation of the lines required coordination, time, and shared agreement. They were visible to neighboring groups who crossed the region. Their presence may have communicated stability, territorial memory, or collective identity, not through walls or defenses, but through endurance. The lines said that people had been here long enough and together enough to leave something that lasted. Each of these explanations holds gently. None can be dismissed outright. The evidence allows for ritual movement, astronomical awareness, and social coordination to exist side by side. What resists closure is the idea that only one purpose governed the lines. Human practices rarely remain singular over long periods. Meaning accumulates, use shifts. What begins in one context can transform without being erased. The lines were created over generations, not all at once. This alone suggests continuity rather than fixity. A pathway meaningful to one group may have been reused by another, for a different reason within the same framework of marks. The desert, steady and unchanging, allowed intention to layer itself quietly. What complicates consensus is the absence of written explanation. There is no accompanying voice that names the purpose plainly. Interpretation must work outward from material traces, from alignment, wear, repetition, and relationship to the surrounding world. These clues guide thought, but they do not command it. The figures themselves also resist simplicity. Some resemble living beings. Others remain abstract, almost mathematical. Their diversity suggests that a single function may not have governed them all. A spider carved into earth does not speak in the same language as a straight line stretching far into the distance. Meaning may have depended on context known at the time, rather than on a universal rule. Modern perspectives add another layer of difficulty. Seeing the lines from above emphasizes their pictorial quality, yet this viewpoint did not shape their creation. It can quietly distort interpretation, inviting explanations rooted in visibility rather than experience. The makers may never have intended the figures to be seen whole, and so their purpose may not resolve through image alone. What remains is a landscape shaped by intention that exceeds explanation. The lines work, they persist, they align with natural cycles, guide movement, and reflect social cooperation. But they do not simplify themselves into a single story. This lack of consensus is not a failure of archaeology. It is a sign of restraint. Rather than forcing an answer where evidence thins, uncertainty is held carefully. The lines are allowed to be complex, to have meant different things at different times, without needing to be reduced. In the quiet desert, purpose does not shout. It drifts. It settles unevenly across space and memory. The Nazca lines continue to exist without explanation, not because meaning is absent, but because it refuses to collapse into one shape. As dusk returns to the plain and the heat loosens its grip, the ground keeps its markings softly. They remain open, unfinished in interpretation, yet complete in presence. Their purpose may never settle fully, and in that gentle resistance, they continue to invite attention without demanding agreement. From deserts and open skies, the story moves northward into wetlands where the ground holds water like memory. In this colder landscape, time behaves differently. Wood usually disappears here, softened by moisture, consumed by microbes, returned quietly to soil. And yet, once, a single piece endured. The Shigir idol was carved from larch in a world just emerging from ice. Its age reaches farther back than stone monuments and painted caves, into a period when forests were young and humans carried stories rather than records. Against all expectation, the wood survived. It rested, submerged in peat, sealed from air, held gently by cold and water that slowed decay to almost nothing. When it surfaced, it did not arrive as a curiosity, but as a presence. Tall and slender, its body is flattened into planes that catch light unevenly. Carved faces stack along its length, each one distinct, each marked by eyes and mouths reduced to lines and angles. Zigzags, chevrons, and cross-hatching run between them, repeating with a patience that suggests rule rather than decoration. This is not an idle carving. The tool marks are deliberate. Lines meet where they should. Surfaces are smoothed and then interrupted again with pattern. The maker understood how wood behaves, how it resists and yields, how grain guides the cut. Stone tools did the work, edge against fiber, slowly shaping a form meant to stand. The symbolism is layered. Faces do not crowd randomly. They are arranged, separated by bands of pattern that feel like divisions, chapters, or pathways. The motifs repeat with variation, a language without letters. It is abstract, yet grounded in form, not a portrait, not an idol in the later sense, but something between marker and message. What the symbols mean is uncertain, but their complexity is not. This object carries intention that extends beyond utility. It does not cook, cut, or hunt. It communicates. It holds information in shape and repetition, suggesting that meaning was being stored visually long before writing fixed language in place. The survival of the idol changes how early thought is imagined. Woodworking at this level requires planning, patience, and a sense of audience. Someone expected others to see this, to recognize the patterns, to understand that the shapes mattered. The idol implies shared knowledge, passed through observation and memory, reinforced by repetition. Its preservation is as improbable as its message. Peatlands act as quiet vaults, low in oxygen, rich in tannins, unfriendly to decay. Even so, the odds were narrow. The tree had to fall in the right place. The carving had to be placed or dropped where water covered it quickly. Centuries passed, millennia followed. The wood remained. This accident of chemistry allows a rare glimpse into a world that usually vanishes. Most wooden objects from this time are gone, leaving stone and bone to stand in for everything else. The Shigir idol reminds archaeology that what survives is not always what mattered most. Entire symbolic systems may have existed in wood, fiber, paint, and voice, now absent. Because of this, the idol cannot be treated as an exception in creativity, only in survival. It may represent a broader tradition of carving and symbolism that left little trace elsewhere. The absence of companions does not isolate it. It hints at loss. The faces remain calm, their expressions neutral, almost meditative. They do not demand worship. They do not narrate events. They endure. In their stillness is the suggestion of a worldview already complex, already capable of abstraction, pattern, and continuity. As the story moves on, the idol stays behind in its quiet enclosure, no longer submerged, yet still protected. Its wood has crossed a threshold few objects manage to cross. It bridges deep time not by stone or metal, but by chance and patience. The Shigir idol stands as a reminder that human thought was already layered and symbolic when the world was young. It asks for nothing. It simply remains, preserved against all odds, carrying patterns carved long ago, still intact enough to whisper of minds that shaped meaning from wood and left it waiting in the earth. When attention rests on the carved surfaces of the idol, interpretation slows into something quieter than explanation. Meaning does not announce itself through labels or captions. It settles into repetition, spacing, and rhythm. The imagery asks to be read the way one reads a landscape, not for a single message, but for patterns that guide movement of thought. Abstract thinking lives comfortably here. The faces are not portraits. They do not attempt likeness. They reduce the human form into essentials, lines for eyes, marks for mouths, planes for presence. This reduction is itself a decision. It shows a mind capable of stepping away from the immediate world and working instead with ideas of form. Abstraction does not appear accidentally. It emerges when a maker chooses concept over imitation. The repeated motifs that stretch between faces deepen this sense of abstraction. Zigzags, parallel lines, intersecting angles. They do not decorate aimlessly. They are consistent enough to feel intentional, as if they follow rules understood by the maker and the audience. These shapes do not describe objects. They suggest relationships, movement, division, continuity. They point toward ideas that cannot be shown directly. Such imagery implies a shared internal language. For symbols to function, more than one person must recognize them. The carver was not working in isolation from understanding. The patterns would have been legible to others who had learned to see them as meaningful. This suggests cultural memory, knowledge carried not only by individuals, but by communities across time. Memory does not always live in stories alone. It can be held in objects, in repeated designs that act as reminders. An image carved today can carry forward an idea learned long before, reinforcing it through visibility and endurance. The idol may have served as such a vessel, storing meaning in wood so it could be encountered again and again. This kind of memory does not depend on writing. It depends on recognition, on seeing a shape and knowing where it belongs within a larger understanding. Oral traditions often work this way. Visual cues anchor stories, rituals, or values that unfold through practice rather than text. The idol's imagery could have operated as a framework, holding concepts steady while words shifted around them. The arrangement of faces hints at sequence. They stack vertically, separated by patterned bands, suggesting progression rather than crowding. One idea gives way to another. Whether this sequence represented lineage, cosmology, stages of life, or something else entirely, its structure implies order, not chaos, not improvisation. An ordering of thought translated into form. The wood itself reinforces this reading. Unlike stone, wood carries grain, direction, and growth history. Working with it requires cooperation with its natural tendencies. The carver followed these lines, integrating the material's own structure into the design. Meaning was shaped not only by intention, but by dialogue with the tree itself. This partnership between idea and material reflects a worldview where thought, nature, and craft remain closely linked. Symbol systems before writing often rely on such integration. They are not fixed alphabets. They are living sets of cues, adjusted through repetition and use. The idol's imagery feels flexible yet disciplined, capable of holding meaning without locking it into exact phrasing. This flexibility allows symbols to survive change. As generations pass, interpretations may shift, but the forms remain. What emerges from this is not a primitive stage of thinking, but a parallel one, a mode of understanding that does not need writing to be complex. It organizes ideas spatially. It encodes memory in texture and shape. It trusts viewers to complete meaning through familiarity rather than instruction. The absence of written explanation does not weaken the imagery. It strengthens it. Without text, the symbols remain open enough to endure. They invite engagement rather than enforcement. Meaning is encountered, not imposed. As the idol stands, it offers no translation. It does not clarify its code. Instead, it demonstrates capacity, the capacity to think abstractly, to preserve memory through form, to build systems of meaning long before words were pinned to surfaces. In this sense, the imagery is less a riddle than a testament. It shows that humans have long been capable of holding layered ideas, of shaping them into lasting forms, and of trusting those forms to speak quietly across time. As the story moves onward, it settles briefly into fire, not roaring flames or spectacle, but controlled heat, steady and intentional, shaped by hands that understood its moods. Long before furnaces were tall and chimneys crowded the skyline, metal was already being persuaded to change its nature. What remains in the record suggests moments of skill that arrive earlier than expected, quiet flashes of knowledge that do not fit neatly into a straight line of progress. In several ancient contexts, metal objects appear that carry signatures of deliberate alloying, copper mixed with small, intentional amounts of other elements. Not enough to be accidental, not uniform enough to be chance. The resulting material behaves differently. It hardens, it resists wear, it holds shape longer under stress. These are not properties discovered blindly. They are outcomes noticed, remembered, and repeated. Such mixtures require more than gathering ore. They require attention to temperature. Heat that is too low leaves metal stubborn and incomplete. Heat that climbs too high risks collapse, oxidation, or loss. Achieving the narrow range where transformation happens demands experience. Fire must be fed carefully, airflow adjusted by instinct. Color, sound, and timing become guides where measurement tools do not exist. Evidence of this control appears in slag, the glassy byproduct left behind after smelting. Its composition and texture reveal how hot the process became and how long it was sustained. In some early examples, slag suggests temperatures reached with confidence rather than luck. Furnaces or hearths were shaped to hold heat steadily. Fuels were chosen for their intensity. The process was understood well enough to be repeated. What unsettles the narrative is not that ancient people worked metal, but how skillfully they sometimes did so without leaving a long trail of gradual improvement. Certain techniques appear briefly, produce objects of surprising quality, and then fade. Later cultures rediscover similar methods, as if starting again from fragments rather than inheriting a complete tradition. One explanation lies in specialization. Metallurgy does not spread easily without consistent transmission. It depends on observation, timing, and subtle cues difficult to record without writing. When specialists disappear, whether through migration, collapse, or simple demographic shift, the knowledge narrows quickly. A technique can vanish even while its products remain. Another factor is resource dependency. Metalworking relies on access to specific ores, fuels, and environments. A method refined in one region may not translate cleanly elsewhere. When conditions change, when forests thin or trade routes falter, the practice may no longer be sustainable. Knowledge does not disappear from lack of intelligence, but from lack of support. In some cases, later societies valued different outcomes. A strong alloy may have mattered less than speed of production. Durability may have been sacrificed for availability. Progress is not always about refinement. Sometimes it is about adaptation to new priorities. The archaeological record preserves this unevenness. A finely worked blade or ornament appears in an early layer, carrying evidence of controlled heat and deliberate composition. Then silence follows. Similar objects reappear much later, built through different lineages of experimentation. The gap is not ignorance, it is interruption. This challenges the idea that technological knowledge always accumulates smoothly. Fire-based skills are especially vulnerable to loss because they live in practice rather than in form. Once an object is finished, its creation process leaves little behind. Without the maker present, the object becomes mute. It shows what was achieved, not how. Ancient metallurgy, then, offers not a contradiction, but a reminder. Human ingenuity has never moved in a single direction. It rises, pauses, redirects. Knowledge blooms where conditions allow and withers where they do not. The early appearance of advanced techniques does not signal misplaced modernity. It signals patience, observation, and memory operating within fragile systems. As embers cool and metal settles into shape, the record holds these moments gently. Unexpected alloys, heat managed with care, techniques practiced and then forgotten. They do not demand explanation beyond context. They ask instead for humility. The past was capable of more than we often assume, and just as capable of losing what it once knew. The fire goes out, the objects remain, and between them lies a quiet understanding that knowledge, like flame, must be tended continually, or it fades, leaving only warmth remembered in stone and metal. As the embers of earlier craft fade into the soil, the story turns toward loss. Not sudden loss, not catastrophe alone, but the quiet unthreading of knowing. Knowledge, like any living thing, depends on conditions. When those conditions shift, it does not always travel forward. Sometimes it thins, sometimes it breaks. Cultural collapse does not arrive only with fire and ruin. It can arrive through drought that stretches seasons thin, through trade routes that fall silent, through leadership that fragments into smaller circles. When communities disperse, shared practices lose their rhythm, workshops empty, apprenticeship chains break. The tasks that once made sense within a stable world become difficult to maintain when survival demands immediate attention elsewhere. In such moments, complexity is vulnerable. Skills that require long training and specialized focus are often the first to slip away. Metallurgy, precision stonework, complex planning, these depend on continuity more than inspiration. They are not rediscovered easily once lost because they are learned slowly through repetition and correction. When the environment no longer supports the time needed to learn, the knowledge narrows to memory and then to silence. Another force works quietly alongside collapse. Skill bottlenecks. In many early societies, expertise concentrated in a small number of individuals. Knowledge was not evenly distributed. A master knew what others did not, and that knowledge passed through narrow channels. This efficiency allowed high skill to flourish quickly, but it carried risk. When a specialist died without training successors, a whole practice could end with them. This bottleneck effect does not require disaster. It can emerge through ordinary life, illness, migration, conflict. A single missing link can dissolve a chain built over generations. Objects remain, but their making does not. What survives appears miraculous only because its context has vanished. Fragile transmission deepens this problem. Before writing, knowledge lived in demonstration and memory. It traveled through hands, voice, and shared presence. Such transmission can be powerful, adaptable, and nuanced, but it is also delicate. It depends on proximity and time spent together. Remove either, and the signal weakens. Even after writing appears, not all knowledge enters text. Some skills resist description. They rely on feel, timing, and sensory cues that defy instruction. Fire behaves differently each day. Stone responds subtly to pressure. These lessons are absorbed, not read. When circumstances prevent that absorption, the knowledge cannot be preserved by objects alone. There is also the matter of choice. Societies do not carry everything forward. Technologies that once mattered may become irrelevant as needs shift. A technique may be known but unused, set aside because it no longer serves. Over time, unused knowledge atrophies. Without practice, memory fades. Without memory, rediscovery becomes guesswork. The archaeological record reflects these patterns unevenly. A finely made tool appears, then nothing similar follows. A structure demonstrates organization that later layers do not repeat. These gaps are not errors. They are signatures of human lives adapting to changing worlds. Loss does not imply failure, it implies constraint. Sometimes knowledge disappears precisely because it was efficient. A perfect solution built for a specific place and time may not travel well. When that place changes, the solution becomes obsolete. Broader, less refined methods persist because they adapt more easily. The elegant gives way to the practical. This understanding reframes early achievement. Moments of sophistication are not anomalies. They are peaks shaped by favorable conditions. When those conditions pass, the peaks erode, leaving traces that seem mysterious only because the valleys around them are unfamiliar. What archaeology encounters, again and again, is not a broken ladder of progress, but a braided path. Knowledge threads cross, separate, and sometimes vanish beneath the ground. The absence of continuity does not diminish human capacity. It reveals its dependence on stability, cooperation, and time. As the story settles here, loss becomes part of the pattern rather than an exception. Knowledge does not vanish because humans forget how to think. It vanishes because thinking requires care, community, and continuity. Remove any one of these, and even the brightest skill can fade quietly away. The ground holds what remains. Objects endure where instruction does not, and in that imbalance, archaeology listens carefully, learning not only what was known, but what it takes to keep knowing alive. As the story continues, a subtle tension begins to surface, not tied to any single object or site, but to the spaces between them. Archaeology is built on sequences, layer upon layer, step following step, change unfolding gradually through time. Most of the past arranges itself this way. Tools evolve slowly, methods refine themselves. Small adjustments accumulate until something new appears, but not always. Again and again, the record presents moments where a technology seems to arrive fully formed. A method appears with confidence, already refined, already effective. The expected earlier versions are missing. There are no crude beginnings, no tentative experiments preserved in earlier layers. The change does not creep, it steps into view. These sudden appearances do not dominate the past, but they punctuate it. They create pockets of discomfort where the story resists smooth narration. A blade shows skill before its rough drafts appear. A structure demonstrates organization without visible rehearsal. A technique behaves as though it has practiced elsewhere, somewhere not yet found. This absence does not imply impossibility. It implies incompleteness. Archaeology depends on survival. Only a fraction of what once existed remains. Organic materials vanish. Temporary structures dissolve. Early experiments, by nature, are often fragile. If a new idea begins with perishable tools, those stages may leave no trace at all. What survives is the moment when the method finally hardens into something durable. Yet even accounting for loss, some transitions feel unusually compressed. The leap between what comes before and what appears next feels larger than erosion alone can explain. These jumps unsettle timelines not because they contradict them, but because they challenge their resolution. Timelines prefer continuity. They assume progression moves at a pace that leaves breadcrumbs behind. When breadcrumbs are missing, the path grows hazy. Interpretation must slow. Assumptions must loosen. The story cannot be told cleanly without acknowledging uncertainty. Part of this problem arises from how change actually happens. Innovation does not always spread evenly. A technique can remain localized, practiced quietly within a small group. It can mature away from the centers we have excavated, leaving little material behind. When that group migrates or trades, the technique appears elsewhere suddenly, without its developmental history traveling with it. There is also the effect of preservation bias. Archaeological visibility favors certain materials and places. Stone survives better than wood, Dry ground preserves more than wet. Permanent settlements leave clearer records than seasonal camps. A transition that occurs in invisible contexts will remain invisible even if it was gradual at the time. In some cases, transitions occur not through slow modification, but through synthesis. Separate ideas combine suddenly into a new form. Each component may have existed earlier, scattered across time and space. When they meet, the result feels abrupt, even though its parts are ancient. What appears as a leap may be a convergence. Still, the discomfort remains. Missing transitions complicate confidence. They remind researchers that timelines are not mirrors of reality, but models shaped by survival and discovery. Each new find has the power to soften or sharpen these gaps. Until then, the absence must be held honestly. This unsettles more than dates. It unsettles assumptions about pace. The idea that early societies change slowly and predictably is gently challenged here. Humans have always been capable of sudden reorganization when conditions allow. When resources align, when knowledge intersects, when need presses sharply, transformation can arrive faster than expected. The problem of missing transitions does not undo what is known, it frames it. It encourages caution in claims of firsts and origins. It asks archaeologists to distinguish between what did not exist and what simply has not been found. In this light, the gaps are not accusations against the past. They are reminders of scale. Human history is vast. Archaeology samples it unevenly. What we hold is not the whole fabric, but scattered threads. As the narrative moves through these silent intervals, the story remains intact, though less certain. It becomes softer at the edges, less rigid in its steps. The past, it seems, does not always announce its beginnings clearly. Sometimes it waits, offering only the finished form, and leaves the journey itself hidden in the ground. The missing transitions stay where they are, not as failures of knowledge, but as spaces where humility belongs. By now, the pattern beneath the mysteries has begun to feel less like surprise and more like gravity. What we know of the past is shaped not only by what once existed, but by what managed to endure long enough to be found. Archaeology does not recover history as it was lived, it recovers what resisted time. Stone persists, fired clay survives, metal endures, bent and corroded but still present. Everything else exists on borrowed time. This imbalance quietly guides interpretation, tilting our understanding toward what lasts rather than what mattered most. The past that reaches us is not complete, but filtered, thinned by chemistry, climate, and chance. Whole lifeways may vanish without trace, while a single durable object carries disproportionate weight simply because it survived. Organic materials are especially vulnerable. Wood swells, softens, and collapses. Fiber frays and dissolves. Leather dries, cracks, and returns to dust. Bone survives longer, but even it yields eventually to acidic soils and shifting groundwater. What this means, quietly and consistently, is that the everyday world disappears first. Baskets, clothing, shelters, ritual objects made from plant matter, all the things that structure daily life rarely endure. They leave shadows rather than forms. When archaeology reconstructs societies, primarily through stone tools and pottery shards, it is not because stone defined those societies, but because stone outlived everything else. This creates an illusion of simplicity. Early humans can appear technologically limited, not because they were, but because much of their ingenuity was expressed through materials that decayed. Complex wooden tools, woven traps, boats, Musical instruments, symbolic carvings, and architectural frameworks could all vanish entirely, leaving behind no direct trace. What remains may suggest gaps or sudden leaps simply because the transitional steps were built from fragile substances. Knowledge carried in practice rather than material leaves almost no footprint once the practice stops. Climate deepens this distortion. Cold, dry, or oxygen poor environments act as time capsules, preserving what would vanish elsewhere. Peat bogs, deserts, frozen ground, and sealed caves create rare windows where organic worlds briefly survive. The discoveries that emerge from these places often feel shocking, not because they were rare in their time, but because they were rare in survival. A single preserved garment or wooden structure can suddenly expand our sense of what was possible, not by adding novelty, but by restoring balance. This uneven survival influences timelines. When earlier phases disappear, later stages appear abrupt. Technologies seem to arrive without rehearsal. Symbol systems appear fully formed. Organizational capacity looks sudden rather than cultivated. In reality, the rehearsal may have existed for centuries in perishable form. The absence of evidence is mistaken for absence of activity, and history compresses artificially. Preservation bias also affects where archaeology looks. Areas rich in durable material receive more attention, while regions where organic life dominated remain quieter in the record. Entire cultures adapted to wetlands, forests, coastlines, and river systems may be underrepresented simply because their material world dissolved more completely. What feels like silence may once have been dense with activity. Even interpretation itself bends under this weight. Durable monuments are easier to classify, easier to measure, easier to compare across cultures. Subtle practices leave fewer anchors. Over time, narratives can privilege what is visible and minimize what is inferred. The risk is not deliberate neglect, but structural imbalance. Archaeology must constantly remind itself that what survives is not neutral. Understanding preservation bias does not weaken the past. It makes it more human. It explains why certainty thins as stories reach farther back. It clarifies why mysteries cluster where fragile materials likely carried the missing answers. It reframes gaps not as failures of knowledge, but as expected outcomes of time acting unevenly on matter. As the story moves forward, this awareness settles into place. Every artifact becomes both presence and absence. Every discovery carries with it the echo of what did not survive alongside it. History, in this light, is not a broken record. It is a partial one, shaped by endurance rather than intention. And in learning to listen carefully to what remains, archaeology also learns to respect what time quietly carried away. As the story reaches farther into the past, it begins to move through regions where words were never pinned to surfaces. No clay tablets pressed with marks, no ink fixed to parchment, no symbols arranged to freeze language in place. For these cultures, memory lived differently. It moved through voices, gestures, rhythms, and repeated acts. What survives of them must be gathered indirectly through objects that were never meant to explain themselves. Archaeology, in these cases, becomes an art of inference rather than translation. A stone tool hints at intention through its edge. A hearth suggests gathering through its ash. A pattern of postholes whispers of walls long collapsed. Meaning is reconstructed from absence as much as presence, assembled carefully from what endured when speech did not. Material clues become the only vocabulary available, and they speak slowly. This dependence on material traces carries natural limits. Objects can show use, but not always belief. They can suggest function, but rarely motive. A polished surface implies care. A repeated form implies tradition. Beyond that, interpretation begins to thin. Without written records, there is no direct access to myth, law, cosmology, or personal memory. Relationships between groups must be inferred from shared styles or traded materials. Conflict is guessed at through trauma marked on bone or sudden abandonment of sites. Ritual is suggested through unusual deposition or deliberate breakage. Each reading remains tentative, grounded in probability rather than certainty. The past, here, does not speak in sentences. It offers fragments and asks for patience in how they are arranged. Silence deepens this challenge. When writing is absent, there is no internal commentary to guide interpretation, no correction from those who lived the practices, no explanation of why a structure was built or why an object was buried rather than used. Modern observers fill that silence with frameworks drawn from what they know, which risks distortion. Practices can be misunderstood when they are translated through unfamiliar lenses. What looks like hierarchy may have been seasonal leadership. What looks like warfare may have been ritualized conflict. What looks like simplicity may hide complexity expressed through materials that no longer exist. The quieter the record, the easier it is for assumption to take root. Yet this silence is not emptiness, it is density held differently. Oral cultures often preserve knowledge with extraordinary precision, embedding memory in story, song, and repeated movement. Without writing, memory is not outsourced to objects, it is rehearsed constantly. That rehearsal leaves fewer durable traces, but it does not reflect a lack of depth. It reflects a different relationship with time. Knowledge remains alive through use, not storage. When such cultures disappear or transform, their intellectual world can vanish almost completely, leaving behind only the physical shell of daily life. This is where mystery emerges most strongly. Not the dramatic mystery of missing artifacts, but the quiet mystery of intention that can no longer be accessed. Archaeology encounters a closed loop. The objects are present, the context is partially recoverable, the meaning refuses to settle. Each interpretation feels plausible, yet incomplete. Competing explanations coexist without resolution, not because the evidence is weak, but because it cannot speak beyond its material limits. Silence, in this sense, becomes productive. It forces restraint. It prevents easy narratives from forming. It reminds researchers that confidence must remain proportional to evidence. The absence of writing guards the past from being overdefined. It asks for humility. It acknowledges that some knowledge was never meant to endure beyond living memory. As the narrative moves gently onward, cultures without writing remain among the most compelling presences in archaeology. They resist closure. They do not surrender their inner worlds easily. Their silence is not a flaw in the record, but a reflection of how knowledge once lived. In listening to that silence carefully, archaeology does not solve these cultures. It learns to approach them with care, allowing mystery to remain where understanding cannot responsibly go further. As the evidence thins and silence grows thicker, another presence becomes unavoidable, disagreement that lingers without resolution. These are not loud arguments or dramatic splits, but sustained differences held carefully over decades. In archaeology, disagreement is often a sign that a question has been examined deeply enough to resist easy answers. Competing models arise when the same fragments can be assembled in more than one coherent way. Each model fits the known facts, accounts for the material record, and explains part of the story well. The difficulty is that none explains all of it without strain. Instead of one theory replacing another, Several remain standing, adjusted and refined as new data arrives, yet never collapsing into a single, shared conclusion. These models often differ not in evidence, but in emphasis. One approach may privilege environmental factors, reading changes in material culture as responses to climate, resource availability, or landscape pressure. Another may foreground social organization, seeing the same changes as expressions of belief, identity, or internal structure. A third may focus on technological constraint or opportunity, tracing shifts through tools, materials, and skill transmission. All can be supported by the same artifacts, the same sites, the same dates. The disagreement does not come from ignorance. It comes from interpretation, standing at the edge of what the material can support. Inconclusive evidence lies at the heart of this endurance. Archaeological data rarely arrives complete. A site may be partially excavated, contexts may be disturbed, organic material may be absent. Dating ranges may overlap instead of resolving cleanly. Small uncertainties compound quietly, leaving space where confidence cannot fully settle. Each new discovery has the potential to tip the balance, yet just as often it reinforces ambiguity, strengthening multiple interpretations at once. Evidence that seems decisive in one framework may appear peripheral in another. Time deepens this tension. Early excavations often lacked modern techniques, leaving gaps that cannot be recovered. Later reanalysis depends on what was documented, not what was lost. As methods improve, older conclusions are revisited, but revision does not guarantee resolution. Sometimes it reveals how finely balanced the interpretations already were. Consensus stalls not because progress has stopped, but because progress has refined the questions faster than it has narrowed the answers. There is also a cultural dimension to these disagreements. Scholars are trained within traditions that shape how they see evidence. Methodological preferences, theoretical backgrounds, and regional experience all influence interpretation. These perspectives do not cancel each other out. They coexist, testing one another gently over time. Productive disagreement becomes a way of maintaining rigor, preventing premature closure where certainty would be misleading. Importantly, archaeology lacks the ability to resolve debates through controlled repetition. No experiment can be rerun. No past moment can be recreated under new conditions. When lines of evidence diverge, there is no final test to silence alternatives completely. Instead, theories age alongside the data, refined, constrained, sometimes weakened, but rarely eliminated outright. Some disagreements endure because the stakes are conceptual rather than factual. They concern how change happens, whether gradual or punctuated, centralized or diffuse, driven by necessity or belief. These questions extend beyond any single site. They shape how the human past is understood as a whole. As long as evidence remains fragmentary, multiple models will continue to share space. What may appear frustrating from the outside is, within the discipline, a form of care. To force consensus where evidence remains thin would close inquiry prematurely. Leaving disagreement open keeps the past available to future insight. It allows new techniques, new sites, and new questions to enter the conversation without having to undo rigid conclusions. As the story continues, these unresolved debates become part of the landscape rather than obstacles within it. They remind archaeology that understanding is provisional, shaped by patience rather than certainty. Some questions do not fade with time. They persist quietly, refined by every generation that engages them, waiting not for agreement, but for clarity sufficient to justify it. As the story moves forward once more, it does not rise upward or sink deeper, but sharpens its focus, learning how to see without disturbing what lies beneath. New tools do not arrive loudly, they arrive quietly, extending perception rather than replacing it. Among these, light itself becomes a guide. LiDAR, pulses of laser light sent from above and reflected back from the ground, slips through forest canopies and tangled growth, brushing past leaves and branches to touch the surface below. What returns is not an image, but a contour, a memory of shape recorded with precision. Hills flatten, trees dissolve, and beneath them, lines appear where none were visible before. Causeways stretch across swamps, terraces step down hillsides, grids emerge where jungle once seemed untouched. The land begins to tell a fuller story, not by excavation, but by revelation. This shift changes scale immediately. What once appeared as isolated ruins reveal themselves as parts of larger systems. A temple is no longer alone. It belongs to a network of roads, reservoirs, neighborhoods, and fields. Settlements once thought ceremonial only show signs of dense populations and careful planning. Cities thought small expand outward into complex urban landscapes shaped deliberately over centuries. These are not hidden because they were rare. They were hidden because forests reclaimed them, soil softened their edges, and time folded them gently into the terrain. LiDAR does not invent these cities. It simply restores their outlines, allowing them to exist again in relation to one another. As entire landscapes emerge, long-standing assumptions begin to loosen. Regions once believed sparsely populated now show evidence of intensive land management. Hillsides bear traces of agriculture scaled carefully to prevent erosion. Water systems snake across lowlands, guiding seasonal floods into usable patterns. Defensive structures link settlements in chains rather than standing alone. These revelations do not rewrite history overnight, they refine it. They show that complexity often spread horizontally rather than vertically, through distributed networks rather than towering centers. The past grows wider rather than taller. What is most striking is how much had been missed simply because it was hidden in plain sight. Dense vegetation created an illusion of emptiness. When that layer is digitally lifted away, human presence fills the space beneath. This does not diminish earlier interpretations, it explains their limits. Archaeologists could only see what the surface allowed. Now, without turning a single stone, entire regions become readable again. These tools also change how excavation is approached. Instead of searching blindly, researchers can move with intention, guided by patterns revealed from above. Excavation becomes confirmation rather than discovery. Fragile sites remain protected longer, context is preserved more carefully, knowledge grows with less loss. The past is touched more lightly. What emerges from this is not a sudden clarity, but a deepening one. Old mysteries do not vanish, they become grounded within richer settings. A single structure is no longer asked to explain everything on its own. It becomes part of a living landscape, shaped by movement, labor, and time. Questions shift from whether something existed to how it was connected. This widening view also reframes absence. When a transition seems missing in one place, its traces may appear elsewhere across the landscape, too subtle or extensive to notice before. Networks make sense of gaps. What felt abrupt begins to feel distributed. The story stretches out, smoothing some of its sharp edges. As the tools continue to improve, the ground grows more transparent, but never fully exposed. Even now, What is revealed depends on where attention is directed, where forests still stand, where technology can reach. Each new image reminds archaeology that discovery is not finished, only paced. Vast portions of the world remain unread, not because nothing is there, but because we have not yet learned how to see them clearly. In this gentle unveiling, the past regains dimension. Cities breathe beneath trees, fields whisper beneath vines, roads lie patient under moss and shadow. Entire landscapes wait, not hidden by secrecy, but by growth. And as new tools continue to refine vision, history does not become louder. It becomes broader, offering a quieter, more complete sense of how much has always been there. As more of the landscape quietly reveals itself, another truth settles in alongside the discoveries. Archaeology is never finished with its own conclusions. What once felt solid loosens. What seemed settled bends gently under new light. This constant revision is not a flaw in the discipline, it is its defining strength. The past does not change, but our angle toward it does, and with each shift in perspective, long-held assumptions are tested again. Many archaeological ideas began as careful guesses built from limited evidence. Early excavations worked with smaller samples, fewer tools, and narrower comparative frameworks. From this, broad models were drawn, often cautiously, sometimes boldly. Over time, these models hardened into teaching, timelines, and expectations. They shaped what researchers looked for, and sometimes what they did not. When new discoveries appear outside those expectations, they do not simply add detail, they force rethinking. Recent reversals often emerge from quiet contradictions rather than dramatic revelations. A site dated slightly earlier than expected, a material found where it was not supposed to be, a settlement larger than models predicted. None of these overturn the past on their own. Together, they begin to strain older frameworks until revision becomes unavoidable. Archaeology rarely flips its conclusions suddenly. It revises them gradually, folding in anomalies until the shape of the story changes. Technology plays a powerful role in this process. New dating techniques tighten time ranges that once spanned centuries. Microscopic analysis reveals traces of activity invisible to the naked eye. Remote sensing exposes patterns far beyond the scale of individual excavations. Each advance does not merely answer questions, it reveals which questions were incomplete to begin with. Conclusions built without these tools are not wrong, they are provisional. Past assumptions are also overturned as voices broaden. Archaeology was once dominated by a narrow set of cultural perspectives. Interpretations reflected the values and expectations of their time. As scholarship becomes more global and interdisciplinary, alternative readings gain ground. Practices once labeled primitive are reinterpreted as adaptive. Structures once seen as ceremonial are reconsidered as domestic or vice versa. Meaning shifts not because evidence changes, but because the lens widens. Another source of revision lies in accumulated data. A single site can mislead. A pattern emerges only when many sites are compared across regions and environments. As data sets grow, regional variation becomes clearer. Universal models give way to local complexity. The past fragments into many valid stories rather than one dominant narrative. Archaeology rewrites itself not to erase earlier work, but to make room for difference. This constant rewriting can feel unsettling. Humans crave closure. We like timelines to settle and explanations to hold. Archaeology resists this comfort because its subject resists it. The past was not a single experiment run once under controlled conditions. It was lived unevenly, creatively, and often unpredictably. Certainty, when it appears, is usually narrow in scope. Broad certainty rarely survives long. What emerges instead is confidence tempered by humility. Archaeologists grow skilled at holding conclusions lightly. A model is useful until it is not. An explanation stands until better evidence arrives. Revision becomes routine rather than disruptive. Each rewrite is an act of care, ensuring that the story remains responsive rather than rigid. This is why certainty in archaeology is always temporary, not because knowledge is unstable, but because it is alive. It grows through correction. It strengthens by absorbing contradiction. It becomes more accurate by letting go of what no longer fits. The discipline does not chase final answers. It refines understanding. As the narrative continues, this restless quality becomes reassuring rather than troubling. It means that mysteries are not ignored when they persist. It means that assumptions are not protected at the expense of evidence. Archaeology listens, adjusts, and listens again. In this ongoing process, rewriting is not failure. It is fidelity. Fidelity to a past too complex to be captured once and too important to be frozen in the first shape it takes. As unanswered questions continue to linger, another boundary quietly comes into view, the line between mystery and myth. Mystery grows where evidence thins, but curiosity remains disciplined. Myth grows when uncertainty is filled too quickly, shaped by desire rather than patience. The two can look similar on the surface, both emerging from gaps in knowledge, but they travel very different paths once time and repetition take hold. Myths form naturally in human cultures. When explanations are missing, stories step in to provide coherence. This is not deception, it is instinct. Humans are meaning-making creatures, and silence feels unfinished. A striking structure without an obvious purpose invites imagination. An advanced object without clear ancestry tempts speculation. Over time, these speculations harden through repetition, gaining emotional resonance, symbolic power, and narrative appeal. The story becomes easier to remember than the uncertainty that inspired it. As myths circulate, they often simplify complexity. A gradual process becomes a single dramatic event. Many contributing cultures collapse into one hidden source. Long spans of trial and error condense into sudden revelation. These stories satisfy the need for resolution, even when the evidence does not. Once established, myth resists erosion. It persists because it feels complete, not because it remains accurate. Science approaches the same gaps differently. Instead of filling silence, it treats silence as information. Absence becomes a signal rather than a problem. When evidence runs out, explanation slows rather than accelerates. Competing ideas are allowed to coexist without forcing hierarchy. Language becomes careful. Probability replaces certainty. This restraint can feel unsatisfying, especially when compared to the emotional clarity of myth, but it preserves openness. Scientific pushback against myth does not arrive as confrontation. It arrives as boundary setting. Archaeology does not argue against imagination itself. It argues against replacing evidence with narrative certainty. When claims extend beyond what materials can support, they are gently set aside, not dismissed as foolish, but recognized as unanchored. This is not cynicism. It is protection for the past and for inquiry itself. The pressure to mythologize increases as mysteries endure. The longer a question remains open, the more tempting it becomes to resolve it through story alone. Media amplifies this tendency, favoring clean arcs and dramatic origins. Over time, repetition can blur the line between speculation and fact. What began as curiosity can quietly harden into belief. Restraint matters because archaeology does not deal in symbols alone. It deals in lives that were lived, choices that had consequences, and cultures shaped by real conditions. To mythologize prematurely risks flattening that reality. It replaces human adaptability with spectacle. It trades patient understanding for certainty that cannot be tested. Restraint also leaves space for discovery. When explanations are held lightly, new evidence can change them without resistance. When a myth dominates, contrary findings are often forced to fit rather than allowed to reshape the story. Science protects the future by refusing to close doors too early. Importantly, mystery itself is not a flaw. It is an honest reflection of scale. The human past stretches across immense spans of time, most of which left no durable record. Expecting complete clarity from fragmentary remains misunderstands both time and survival. Mystery acknowledges limitation without surrendering rigor. Myth seeks to comfort, science seeks to understand. Both respond to uncertainty, but only one maintains a feedback loop with evidence. In archaeology, restraint is not absence of imagination, but disciplined imagination. Imagination that listens before it speaks and stops when the ground beneath it dissolves. As the narrative moves gently forward, the difference between mystery and myth becomes less about belief and more about responsibility. Mystery keeps the past open, myth closes it prematurely. One invites care, the other invites certainty. In choosing restraint, archaeology does something quietly radical. It allows questions to remain unanswered without apology. It accepts that some stories are still forming and others may never fully resolve. This does not weaken the story of humanity. It keeps it honest, complex, and unfinished, which is perhaps the most human shape it can take. As the many strands of evidence settle together, the picture that forms is quieter than myth, yet far more demanding than the old assumptions ever allowed. The unresolved puzzles, the missing transitions, the sudden appearances of skill and coordination all point toward the same gentle correction. Early humans were not simple minds waiting patiently for progress to arrive. Their intelligence has been consistently underestimated, not because it was hidden, but because it was expressed in ways that rarely survive intact. Intelligence, in this deeper view, is not measured by writing, metal, or monument alone. It is measured by adaptation, by memory held across generations, by the ability to observe patterns in the world and respond with intention. What emerges is a form of intelligence deeply grounded in environment. Early humans understood stone well enough to shape it with precision, wood well enough to carve meaning into it, fire well enough to coax metal into new forms, and landscape well enough to organize space on a scale that exceeded individual lifetimes. These are not isolated sparks of cleverness. They are sustained habits of thought. They require attention, patience, error correction, and the ability to teach others. None of these are trivial capacities. They are the foundations of cognition itself. Planning, too, appears far earlier and more often than once assumed. Planning is not simply imagining the future, it is coordinating action toward that future despite uncertainty. Quarrying stone that will only become useful months later. Clearing land for patterns meant to be seen by others not yet present. Building structures whose purpose extends beyond immediate survival. These acts rely on trust, not only in materials, but in people. They require shared timelines, agreed roles, and confidence that effort invested now will matter later. This ability to plan was not confined to elites or specialists alone. it was distributed across communities. Large projects could not proceed without coordination, shared rules, and the ability to resolve conflict. Food had to be gathered, labor had to be sustained, knowledge had to be remembered accurately enough to guide action long after the original decision was made. These are social achievements as much as technical ones, and they speak to a depth of cooperation that modern perspectives often reserve for much later societies. Cultural complexity grows naturally from this foundation. Culture is not decoration added after survival is secured. It is the framework that allows survival to scale. Symbol systems, ritual practices, and shared stories create alignment between individuals. They establish meaning beyond the immediate moment. They guide behavior when direct instruction is absent. The archaeological record shows again and again that early humans invested heavily in this shared symbolic world, even when their material resources were limited. What makes this complexity difficult to see is that it often lived in fragile forms: spoken language, ritual movement, seasonal gathering patterns, temporary structures, and symbolic objects made from wood, fiber, or skin all fade quickly. When they vanish, what remains can look deceptively bare. Yet the surviving artifacts often carry subtle signals of the systems that once surrounded them: repetition of form, careful placement, deliberate alignment. These are not accidents, they are traces of cultural logic. The mysteries do not suggest that early humans possessed some lost superior intellect. They suggest something more grounded and more impressive. Human intelligence has always been flexible rather than linear, capable of refinement without permanence, able to solve complex problems locally without producing global continuity. Knowledge could be deep, precise, and effective without being written down, centralized, or preserved beyond its immediate context. Seen this way, the gaps in the record no longer imply absence of thought. They imply abundance of life, lived in ways that did not prioritize durability. Early humans planned, taught, symbolized, and cooperated within worlds tuned closely to their environments. When those environments shifted, their solutions shifted with them, sometimes leaving little behind. As this understanding settles in, the mysteries take on a softer shape. They are not embarrassments for archaeology, nor challenges to human capability. They are reminders that intelligence is not defined by what survives, but by what works. Early humans did not build toward us. They built toward their own futures, using the tools, materials, and meanings available to them at the time. In that quiet reframing, respect replaces surprise. The past no longer looks dim or incomplete. It looks deeply human, rich with thought, planning, and culture that simply chose expressions time could not always keep. As the story draws closer to its quiet horizon, another reality settles gently into place. Not all questions are waiting for answers. Some have already passed beyond reach, carried away not by neglect or failure, but by time doing what it always does. The earth is not an archive built to preserve clarity. It is an active surface, always reshaping itself. Rain softens edges, wind lifts fine detail grain by grain, rivers rearrange valleys, coastlines retreat and advance. Erosion does not erase selectively. It removes patiently, layer by layer, until even the most deliberate traces fade into ordinary ground. What once stood clearly for centuries can dissolve into ambiguity without ceremony, leaving behind only hints that something meaningful once occupied that space. Destruction arrives in quieter forms as well. Fire consumes wood and fiber in moments. Floods scatter artifacts far from where they were made and used. Earthquakes fracture layers, mixing timelines that were once distinct. Volcanic ash preserves some sites perfectly, while sealing others forever beyond reach. Even human activity, repeated farming, construction, or simple reuse of materials, dismantles earlier worlds without intention. Stones are recycled, foundations are reused, sacred places become quarries. What was meaningful in one age becomes raw material in another. Each cycle removes context, and context is often where meaning resides. Lost context is perhaps the most decisive limit of all. An object without its surroundings is only partially legible. Placement matters, orientation matters, association matters. A tool found alone tells a different story than one found beside others, within a structure, near food remains or pigments. Once context is disturbed, interpretation becomes speculation constrained only by caution. Even careful excavation cannot restore what has already been scattered by centuries of pressure, water, roots, or human interference. Some questions hinge entirely on relationships that no longer exist in recoverable form. Time itself enforces forgetting, not through cruelty, but through scale. Human history stretches across spans far greater than written memory. For most of that time, lives were lived fully, without expectation of permanence. Knowledge was practiced, not archived. Meaning was reinforced through repetition, not storage. When those practices ended, there was no backup, no copy waiting to be rediscovered. Once the last voice spoke a story, once the last hand demonstrated a technique, the knowledge moved entirely into the present moment and then quietly vanished with it. This does not imply loss of intelligence or care. It reflects a different relationship with time. Many early cultures lived within cycles rather than lines. Knowledge mattered while it functioned. When conditions changed, new solutions emerged. What worked did not need to be preserved forever. In such a world, durability was not always a priority. The archaeological record inherits the consequences of that choice. There are also moments when questions disappear because they are poorly formed from the start. Modern curiosity sometimes demands precision where the past operated with flexibility. Asking for exact purposes, strict timelines, or singular meanings can impose expectations that do not align with lived reality. Some practices were intentionally open-ended. Some symbols were meant to shift with context. Seeking a final answer where none existed may lead nowhere, not because evidence is missing, but because the question itself does not fit the past it is applied to. As archaeology matures, it learns to recognize these boundaries, not as failures, but as contours of the discipline. Knowing where certainty ends is as important as knowing what lies within reach. Accepting that some questions may never be answered does not weaken understanding, it deepens it. It replaces illusion with honesty. The remaining mysteries become quieter here. They no longer press urgently for resolution. They settle into the background, acknowledged rather than resisted. Erosion, destruction, and lost context are not obstacles to be overcome with enough effort. They are forces that shape what knowing itself can be. As this section closes, the past feels no less rich for these limits. If anything, it feels more alive. It reminds us that history was not created to be fully recovered. It was lived, moment by moment, without regard for how much would remain. What reaches us is a gift shaped by chance and endurance, and what does not reach us still belongs to the story, even if it must remain unnamed. As the journey reaches its final stretch, the story does not resolve into certainty. It settles instead into something softer and more durable, an acceptance that history is incomplete by nature. What remains of the past is not a finished account waiting to be read aloud. It is a collection of signals that survive chance, climate, and time. Each signal carries weight, yet none stands alone. Together, they suggest a world that cannot be fully reconstructed, only approached. This incompleteness is not a weakness, it is a condition of deep time itself. The earth has always been moving, erasing and preserving unevenly, allowing some moments to endure while others dissolve entirely. What archaeology holds, therefore, is not the past as it was, but the past as it endured. Within this incompleteness, mystery becomes more than absence. It becomes a productive tension that keeps understanding alive. When evidence refuses to settle, thought remains flexible. Competing ideas continue to sharpen each other. New tools arrive with the possibility of revealing patterns once invisible. Younger researchers approach old material with different questions, different assumptions, different patience. Mystery prevents the past from becoming static. It resists being framed once and then put away. Instead, it invites return, it invites care, it invites listening rather than closure. This tension works quietly. It does not demand answers. It maintains space where discovery can still happen. A fragment without explanation does not stall inquiry. It anchors it. It reminds archaeology that confidence must always be proportional to evidence. In these unresolved spaces, humility becomes part of knowledge rather than its opposite. Scholars learn to describe what they see without inflating what they cannot. The discipline matures not by eliminating mystery, but by learning to live alongside it responsibly. Unanswered evidence also acts as a guard against oversimplification. The human past was not a smooth sequence of upgrades, nor a single shared path toward the present. It was uneven, local, inventive, and often fragile. When explanations feel too neat, unresolved evidence pulls gently against them, restoring texture. It reintroduces variability. It resists grand narratives that flatten difference in the name of clarity. In doing so, it keeps the past closer to how it was lived, uncertain, adaptable, and responsive to immediate conditions. There is also a quiet ethical dimension here. To claim more certainty than evidence allows is to impose modern desire onto ancient lives. Restraint honors the distance between now and then. It acknowledges that some meanings belonged exclusively to their time and place, that not every intention was meant to be legible across millennia. Letting some questions remain open respects that boundary. At the same time, knowledge continues to unfold. New discoveries still arrive. Landscapes once invisible are revealed gently through light and data. Materials once dismissed are re-examined with refined techniques. Contexts once lost can sometimes be partially restored through pattern and comparison. The unfolding is not dramatic, it is incremental. Each edition shifts perspective slightly, changing how earlier evidence is understood. Knowledge grows not by replacing mystery, but by weaving around it. This ongoing process ensures that archaeology remains dynamic. It stays awake. It listens differently as its tools and questions evolve. The past, in this sense, is never finished speaking. It responds differently depending on how it is approached. What could not be known before may become visible later. What still cannot be known remains present as a reminder of scale, of time, of the limits inherent in recovery. As the story comes to rest, there is no final answer offered, and none is needed. The quiet power of unanswered evidence lies in its ability to keep curiosity grounded and wonder disciplined. It encourages attentiveness without certainty. It allows the listener to sit with the past rather than resolve it. History, incomplete and uneven, continues to breathe through what remains. Mystery, holds the space where future understanding may grow. Knowledge does not close, it unfolds, slowly, patiently, guided by evidence that speaks softly and refuses to be rushed.